Hello, everybody. Welcome back. We just heard about the important discussion on the role of the energy transition as part of urban adaptation building. And now we're going to move on to discuss another very important topic for urban adaptation, which is the role of the private sector. We all know that public funding will never be enough to tackle climate change. So the role of the private sector is absolutely critical. Now, the challenge is how to attract more private investment into cities. How can we build a bridge, a stronger connection between urban affairs and private sector investment? And to discuss this, we have a fantastic panel with us today. Thank you so much for joining us. And I would like to begin by introducing our moderator, Jorge Gastelumendi, who's the Director of Global Policy at the Adrian R. Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center, who is going to be introducing our speakers today. Jorge, the floor is yours.
Mauricio and Jeannie, many thanks for the invitation. A pleasure to be here with all of you for this important conversation. I wanted to just share how we are going to be organizing this session for the next hour and a half. So you have the audience have a sense of how this is going to flow, and then make a tiny introduction and then move into the panelists. So we're going to have for the first part of the session, a couple of rounds of interventions from the panelists. The first round is going to be just opening remarks. Then we move into addressing some of the questions that are in the program, and that will allow panelists to react to some of those questions as a second round of interventions. Those are going to be short interventions, each of them. And then we'll dedicate about 40 minutes towards the end of the session, the second half, for discussion. So please be prepared to write down some of your questions, additional inquiries for the panelists, and I'll try to facilitate a discussion between the panelists and the audience as much as we can to make it interactive. So with that, let me open up. I would say that I'm sure that, over the past day and a half, you've been able to discuss different aspects of urban adaptation finance and the relevance of providing financial resources towards these critical actors in the fight against climate change. But one thing that caught my attention when I was invited to this panel to facilitate the panel on the topic itself is that the majority of assets and services that exist in cities are either public goods or public services. And so we have a question here is, we have two avenues. One is, do we wait for the public actors within a city to figure out how to regulate and mainstream climate change into the management of those goods and services? And so as a private sector, do we wait for that to happen? Which is a usual answer that I've received over years from a private sector. Let's wait for the governments to actually move first on climate change. Or the other option is there a different role than the one that historically has been played by the private sector, a complementary role? I wouldn't say that complete shift, but a complementary role to what they do for their financial bottom line, and look for ways in which they can play a role that it's more proactively addressing climate risks and supporting some of the management of those goods, those public goods and those public services down the road. So climate change is a dynamic phenomena, very fast moving. So we might not have a lot of time to debate whether one way or the other is the best. We just need to act. So with that, let me open the panel with Alice Charles. I'll give her the floor for the next 5 minutes. Alice Charles is a lead for cities, infrastructure, and urban services at the World Economic Forum, which includes the Global Future Council on Cities and Urbanization, the Future of Real Estate, and also co-leads the Net Zero Carbon Cities, an Integrated Approach Initiative, and the Biodiverse Cities. Alice, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, first of all. So I'm going to return to the questions that were posed in advance in terms of how can cities use public sector resources to leverage private funding for urban adaptation. So before I get specific, I'm just going to focus on what we generally hear at a high level from the private sector in terms of investment in infrastructure generally in cities. And of course, most of that investment that we see generally relates to climate related infrastructure at the moment. So generally what we hear is we have lots of available funds, but there's a lack of bankable projects. And by that, they mean there's a lack of projects with the risk profile and structure to attract investment. So, and what does that mean again? So it generally means that in some instances, for example, they haven't managed to put forward a business case that is viable, that means that it's worthy of investment. There isn't appropriate risk sharing in place. And this often results because the city doesn't have the technical capacity to prepare a project with the profile and structure to attract investment. And particularly in relation to urban adaptation, is there particular types of investors? So there's a variety of different types of investors, but particularly in relation to biodiversity, most of the investors come from sectors like the insurance space at the moment because they fully understand the risk of not acting and not in implementing nature-based solutions. And in terms of where the private sector gets involved, I think the critical thing that the private sector would say is they're not brought to the table early enough. So they're not brought to the table at that stage where the city is starting to think about preparing the business case for the project. And often the reason they're not brought to the table is, I'm working on a project with a particular city at the moment, and their lawyers are saying, oh, you should not be speaking to the private sector because that could impact procurement at a later stage. Whereas the city, the planning department is recognizing that they need to speak to the private sector to understand the latest innovation and technology. So when they prepare to procure for this infrastructure, that they're actually procuring the latest innovation and technology. So I think what we would consistently hear from the private sector is they're not brought in early enough, and they would say that in bringing in the private sector, you're not just bringing in the private sector, you're also bringing in civil society and academia at that very early stage as well, to ensure you're availing of the latest research and also considering the views of citizens, because that can often derail infrastructure projects as they continue. So I suppose specifically, what can a city do right here, right now, in terms of thinking about attracting finance? One thing that a city can do is have a really strong integrated land use and transportation plan, and really focus in terms of compactness, because a compact city is a city that can be net zero and is more resilient, but also a compact city means that it's more economical to deliver infrastructure. So it's critical that a city has a plan. It's also critical that related to that, a city has a pipeline of projects, and they've costed those projects. So from an investor's point of view, if you do see that this project is not a one-off and there is a pipeline of projects, then it does make sense in terms of seeking to invest in that location. Beyond that, the city really needs to get its house in order in terms of its financing. And that means addressing its municipal borrowings and creditworthiness, having clear rules governing tax sharing, for example, and transfers of money, etc. But it also needs to have its creditworthiness addressed, and in terms of cost recovery tariffs to ensure sufficient revenue flows to service debt and managers to operate without political interference, for example. But also they have wider soft powers that they can use. So not only producing, for example, an urban plan, but a city has also got powers in terms of bringing the right stakeholders together that need to work together to prepare the case for the transition, for example, of energy infrastructure or the retrofit of buildings. So they have a vital role in terms of bringing together industry with financiers, investors, civil society, and academia, so they can really leverage those soft powers. So I'm going to stop there because we have a lot to discuss in an hour and a half, and just want to give some opening nuggets. Thank you.
Alice, thank you so much. Let me pass then to Jerome Hegeli. Let me read his shortly his bio, so we are aware of his background. Jerome is Group Chief Economist and Managing Editor for the Sigma series at Swiss Re. In this role, Jerome leads the global research teams located in Zurich, New York, Bangalore, Beijing, and Hong Kong. Additionally, he steers a scenario analysis, provides a macro and insurance industry analysis and forecast, while contributing to a sound global financial market architecture and making the world more resilient. So big role there, Jerome, and thanks for joining. And the floor is yours for opening remarks for the next 5 minutes. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Jorge. And this is a big panel. This is a big topic. I would like to make 3 key points. Number 1, it's rating, and ratings. Keep the ratings in mind. Second, bring standardization to the marketplace. Insurance companies are long-term investors. They need to access to standardized asset class. Infrastructure is not a standardized asset class. And that would help also the cities and to address urban adaptation. And third, don't forget insurance. We are key solution to the essential threat, which is climate change. And let me now elaborate on these 3 points. Rating, and ratings. It's essential. Let me show you one statistic. Fact is that actually only about 20% of the cities, they have investment grade rating, and this needs to change. 20% of cities only have IG credit ratings. Actually, the world's 600 largest cities altogether, they account for 60% of global GDP. Now, put this together, 600 largest cities account 60% of global GDP, but only 20% cities have IG ratings. And then let's enter the huge amount of savings pool from pension fund, from the mutual fund industry, and then from insurance companies. They will only invest if you have investment grade credit, meaning you will not allow the investment space to enter the cities if you don't have investment grade rating. That's why rating is essential. That was point number 1. Point number 2, please bring in standardization. It's really essential. Yes, there's a lack of bankable projects, but there's not a lack of capital around. And there's not a lack of investments around. Look at where government bond yields are trading. Look at how still tight credit spreads are. And the money from institutional investors like insurance companies, they would be flowing more in infrastructure assets, also in cities, infrastructure assets, if you would have a standardized asset class, meaning you would have a template in terms of disclosure data, in terms of technical disclosure data of how the project is performing, so that each of the investors can easily access it to the Bloomberg terminals. And this is not the case. There are blueprints around. They need to be applied. It's doable, but it needs to happen on the federal level. That's the second point. And third point, I'm a representative of an insurance company. So I'm here the institutional investor as well, obviously, insurance company with our core business doing underwriting risk, transforming the risk. Both sides of our balance sheet is essential here. On the asset side, yes, we will be, and we are hugely interested in deploying much more assets into infrastructure. But again, if it's not standardized, and if there's no IG credit rating, and if it's not packaged ESG, you won't get the amount of pool of savings into it that otherwise would happen. And second, I think it's really, really important also from the underwriting perspective. Think about the insurance, protect the balance sheets of cities when you upgrade your physical assets, so that you don't get future fiscal risk. What does that mean? That means insurance, but it also means that cities should use risk analysis to understand the impacts on infrastructure assets and the government's budget's implication, and obviously invest a lot in adaptation measures and insurance covers, so disasters can be prevented. And first disaster is the climate change disaster, but the second disaster is if you're not prepared by the climate change dynamics, and if this causes financial distress at the city level. So these were my 3 key points: ratings, standardization, and don't forget insurance. Thank you.
Gero, many thanks for that. Very clear, concrete. Let me pass now to Hassem Galal.
He's a little delayed, Jorge. He's on a phone, so maybe you should go to Ben first and then to Hassem.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I saw his phone.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
I saw him on the phone already connected, so I thought he was already. Yeah. Okay, so we'll go to Ben then. Benjamin Yeo, he's is a senior portfolio manager of global equities at Royal Bank of Canada, Global Asset Management, stewarding approximately $30 billion in assets. Ben is a senior portfolio manager of global equities, 27 billion as of March of 2021. He also sits as chair of the Royal London Asset Management, a responsible investment advisory committee, advising a leading sustainable UK investment trust, and maintains a special interest in global healthcare investing. So with that, Ben, the floor is yours.
Great. I'll just follow on from Alice and Jerome, who I think all make really good points, and just maybe emphasize and expand on a couple of them. So I would emphasize that from a private capital point of view, there isn't a lack of capital. So that's important to understand, and I think I would agree. And this standardization problem is definitely a big problem, which should be somewhat solvable. I would also agree that there are these kind of regulatory and policy headwinds, which is kind of interesting because you thought there should have been tailwinds, and there's tailwinds on some very high level sort of net zero and climate commitments, but there's actually headwinds when you get one level down for doing this, either financial or regulatory and other things, and that's where standardization could really help. So one level on from standardization, perhaps a foundational aspect for that is having transparent metrics or information. So if you have the transparent metrics and information, hopefully somewhat standardized, but at least if you have them, then others can standardize what is needed and what is material. And perhaps this is somewhere where private sector could lend some technical expertise to other groups, so public sector, or maybe a new institution or some other organizing group. So that's the other problem, is that there's no sort of, not necessarily centralized, but no organizing group for this. So it can be a new branch of an old institution, or it might need to be a new organization saying, look, we need these 32 data points. We can standardize at least 20 of them. If you meet this, you're going to get a rating, and this is what's then going to be investable. And then private investors can then say, and you'll need these standards, and this is the kind of thing we look at, and these are things. So you could get that merger, which is doable, and therefore the transparency piece will flow into the standardization piece. The other thing which you could have maybe some technical help is on the sort of policy planning and standard setting part of that, where again, that's perhaps a little bit more of a headwind than a tailwind at the moment. If you're looking at other sort of groups of the kind of final asset owner, so you have like Swiss Re or insurers and asset owners, even private equity and the like, perhaps the one aligned entities is some of these state-owned or local state asset owner enterprises themselves, whether that's through pension funds or other pockets of capital, there are regulatory and policy headwinds for them in order to deploy their capital in some of these or sort of local areas. So that's one area where they could free up, and then you could actually get reasonable co-partnerships for what should be quite aligned thinking. You know, if it's the city's own pension fund or the city's own money or investment money, there's sort of no real theoretical reason why they wouldn't want to use that for you know, market grade returns in their own city, right? They can also do it globally, but to be prevented from doing that when it might align with both financial and fiduciary mandates, as well as a kind of resilience or a local cause, seems to me something which has been missed. And that is also where, if you're doing that, the idea that you could co-share risk or something like that with other entities would definitely work. And then sort of a regulatory headwind for that. The two left field ideas I would throw into the mix at this point in time as well is, I wonder whether cities themselves could start little, I guess you'd call them, you know, from a private market view, sort of like accelerator hubs, but really this is to put expertise in the city in a little kind of hub, so that you go to somewhere, and if you're interested in these kind of ideas, you can pick it up, like the same way that VCs try and get clusters and hubs around tech or whatever. But each city can do it for themselves, for their own particular resiliency and adaptation needs, and therefore then they could be first partners for some of this. These kind of agglomeration effects that you can have as cities, and the technical knowledge and purpose within them, I think is something which is doable, could be partnerships, and it's not really talked about, because when you look at how agglomeration works in general for innovation and solving these things, that's what's kind of occurred naturally. So that's one left field thing. The second left field thing is really this is the problem about the fact that there isn't a lack of capital, and we've talked about the problems with standardization and the like. It's the fact that there's a lack of what I would call organization or capital or relationship or institutional capital to deal with this, and that's the intangible decision making and preference planning for this. And so I wonder whether there needs to be a little bit of work on how to make these sort of decisions either within planning or politics, which can involve people and stakeholders and actually get to decisions being made, as opposed to at the moment it is very much stymied in a political process. And a left field thing would be like that is some of the digital democracy that Taiwan has done. So that you know, using quadratic voting, using open space, you know, all of these things you might hear from Audrey Tang. There might be a way on a city level to involve city citizens in their own decision making, which can pull that in and give you therefore that kind of democratic legitimacy to push some of these projects and things through. And those would be the two kind of left field things that I think might play into this debate. I'll hand back to you on that. Thank you.
Ben, thank you so much for that. Let me check if just a second chance for checking if Hasem is on the line or not. And if not, we can move, of course, to further questions.
Hassan will be there
yeah,
shortly.
coming on right now. Yeah.
Should I didn't get that. Should we wait for a minute, or should we just move to a second round and then we bring Hasem?
Hassan has been listening, so I think you should go to the second round and then he'll enter.
Okay, great. So we'll do that. So one intention of this panel, of course, was to go a bit more into detail and take advantage of the panel as we could. So I just wanted to listen into what Alice, Jerome, and Benjamin have mentioned, is to try to link some of the elements that were mentioned in your interventions to some of the questions that we already have. And so certainly we have heard that there are things that cities could be doing to attract private sector. One thing that Jerome mentioned, for example, the ratings, and how, you know, there's a big gap or need for creditworthiness, you know, ratings. But one question I would have back to the group is, there have been multiple efforts over the past years to try to increase that percentage. And in some cases, we're having some level of success, but in several other cases, the rate hasn't moved much. So and I think Ben was already moving into that direction. That is, what could be done from the private sector to take kind of an early mover position on some of these aspects, while cities, particularly in developing countries, catch up with either a more centralized capacity, or as Ben was saying, kind of a governance mechanism within cities that could be the counterpart for this kind of actions from the private sector. So is there anything in the space of, well, let's pick one of the questions, in the ESG space, in the standardization and KPIs and accountability mechanisms that are being developed as we speak for ESG for private sector, that it's upping up their game? Is there any space for that to be a precursor of ways in which then cities could pick up on those developments and be a good counterpart down the road? Let me open it up. Alice, I'll start with you, go in the same order, just a second round, but happy to start a conversation as needed, and Jerome, and then please jump in as needed. I'm not gonna, let's get into a discussion right now. So Alice, please, the floor is yours.
So it's a difficult question to answer, but I think that there are certainly moves underway in terms of, we have a group of global CEOs that have been working together, first of all, on trying to create standardized metrics around ESG. And I think it was amazing to see the Big Four come together to lead that work in cooperation with us. So there certainly have been moves there. The other thing I wanted to just highlight is something that our real estate CEOs have been doing at the forum, which resonates to a city-related context. So they have been very much focused on trying to transition real estate portfolios, buildings that they own, buildings that they invest in, and buildings that they're developing to ensure that they're net zero carbon. And one of the things they're working on is they have adopted a set of principles to basically look at what they needed to do to transition their portfolios of real estate, which they're trying to get CEOs from across other sectors that own and occupy real estate to adapt. So I guess what I'm trying to get to there is they're in essence setting out a path to transition, which they are adopting as the private sector, but equally the public sector could adopt them, because the biggest owners and occupiers of real estate is generally the public sector, and they could take the lead on transitioning some of their assets. And I think, if you look at, for example, a city like Dortmund, when they think about transitioning their building portfolio, they think about it in terms of these buildings have the ability to generate revenue for us that we can use to invest in other infrastructure projects that actually are more risky and are going to require a greater degree of investment from the public sector, a greater risk balancing towards the public sector side. So what they have been doing there is using initial capital, which they were able to borrow from conventional banking, and using it to retrofit buildings. In doing so, they're also using those buildings as energy generators. So, they are, for example, putting lots of solar panels on the roofs and generating energy, which they're able to sell back into the system. But they're also ensuring that green infrastructure, that biodiversity is incorporated into those buildings and rooftops, etc., to try and bring down the overall temperature of the city. So they're looking at infrastructure projects that they can lead on initially as a city that can have multiple benefits, that can generate payback, that they can then use to invest in other types of projects. And I think that's the type of thing that I'd like to see more cities think about, addressing the issue systemically, and infrastructure projects that can deliver multiple benefits, as well as generating revenue that they can recycle and use for other infrastructure investments.
Alice, for that, have you seen that taking place in you mentioned, was it Dorchester? I didn't get the name of it.
Dortmund in Germany. Yeah, it's Dortmund in Germany.
So then my question still applies. Have you seen any of those efforts in developing countries, in cities in developing countries?
Very, very few, very, very minimal efforts. I think one of the other things just to say, and we haven't really touched upon it here, is in terms of, it tends to be national government that leads in terms of, borrowing for infrastructure projects. It's often a national government ministry that takes the lead. So cities often have limited power in this regard. And I think one of the big issues that cities in particularly in the global south face is there's geopolitical risk. And we obviously have seen that come into the fore in the last couple of weeks with the crisis in Ukraine. And like certainly geopolitical risk is being looked at in a whole new way. Like we're already seeing investment flows out of countries like Finland because they happen to border Russia, for example. So geopolitical risk is something that's often uniquely experienced to an even greater extent in the global south. There's transparency risk. There's also the fact that you have this lack of alignment between national government and city government policy, as well as often lack of alignment politically. And I think somebody like Maurizio can talk about that in terms of his experience when he was mayor of Quito, that there's no interest in the head of state wanting the city to bring forward an infrastructure project because there's different political views. So that often is a barrier. But transparency is a really big problem as well. And I think from an investor's point of view, when we talk about many of the cities in the global south, they will raise the issue of geopolitical risk, they will raise the issue of transparency, but also they will raise the issue of dispute resolution mechanisms. Okay, if we go in and invest, and now it would appear that there's a stable, a stable sort of political system to invest in, what happens when there's a change of government? Are contracts going to be honored? And for a lot of them, they also want to see that there's an effective dispute resolution mechanism in place so that if there is that change of government, that they will have continuity. And so I think that many of those factors prevent investment, particularly in cities in the global south.
Alice, many thanks. Ben, Jerome, any thoughts?
Yeah, definitely. Well, you asked, right, Georgia, you asked, what can we do on the rating side for developing countries, right? That was the question.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's such a complex question. Well, first of all, the institutional investor, institutional long-term investor, they won't uplift the ratings. No, they will want to invest. What needs to happen, and what is happening already, is actually MDBs, multilateral development banks. They are in the middle of it, and there's fantastic, really fantastic work being done by the World Bank's Global Infrastructure Facility. I co-chaired, I had the honor to co-chair the Global Infrastructure Facility of the World Bank for 2 to 3 years, and they provide a lot of projects in developing countries. They provide funds, they provide credit enhancement. They exactly do what you were asking before. They make sure that the access for private
I think he
I think we
froze.
might have lost you.
Yes.
Yeah, looks like we lost
Maybe we bring Hazem in. Maybe we
back.
bring Hazem in.
You're back. You're back.
Oh, sorry.
Jerome,
Can you hear
we
me?
missed the last minute. Yeah, we got it
sorry
from
for that.
multilateral banks, and then we missed it.
Yeah,
So
okay,
from that
perfect.
point.
Can you hear me now again?
Yes, yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry for that. Sorry for the connection. It's a long way from Switzerland, huh? But anyway, I wanted to say the multilateral development banks, they are here in the game to uplift the credit ratings, credit enhancement. Please have a look at the work being done by the Global Infrastructure Facility at the World Bank. I put in the chat a paper which I co-authored together.
Oh,
Yep.
I think we lost.
The transmission lines are too great. Maybe I'll just add a couple of comments on that, and then we can pass to
we can circle back.
Just two quick comments on ESG. There's already quite a lot of work on ESG and ESG metrics. You can get a lot, for instance, from GRESB for ESG benchmarks on real assets. And I think there's a little bit of and I do think cities should leverage off that, both the expertise and the inputting into that. And I think you'll find some more with how the standard settings are going to go for ISSB and some of that. And I do think cities who have the resource should reach out and make sure they're involved in the conversation, partly so that they can get outputs as well as the inputs in. But there is a danger also that you might over rely on some of these and not actually have the people capacity to be able to enact some of this thinking and analysis and join it up. So some of these metrics and benchmarks and transparency is a foundational necessity, but I think you still need essentially some technical expertise or at least capacity to be able to interface with this. And in some ways, because this is going to happen and you can leverage off what private sector or GRESB are doing already, it's more important to have that people capacity or intellectual property capacity to do that, and not to forget that with that. So you can go someone who can go out, understand it, speak the language of private finance as well, understand ratings and uplift and discounts and that things, and bring it together. So you need that kind of connector capacity. I'll hand back to you after that comment.
Thank you, Ben. Jeannie, is it correct that Hazem is already online? Or?
Hazem's right here. Yes, he's here.
Excellent. So,
he's waiting.
good to see you.
Hi, Jorge, and apologies everyone for the logistical
no problem.
complications.
No problem. We're happy to have you here.
Hazem, let me give a brief introduction of your bio, and then I'll give you the floor for next 5 minutes just to give opening remarks on this topic overall, and then we can go into continue with the discussion that we're having. So Hazem Galal, he's a global leader for cities and local government at PwC Middle East. He has expertise in strategy formulation and implementation for cities and local government entities, including smart cities. He is currently the project advisor for the World Economic Forum's research on IoT and 5G sustainable models for impact, and previously advised on the future cities and urban services, shaping the future of urban development and services. So Hazem, the floor is yours for opening remarks and for sharing a bit of your views on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Jorge. I mean, I have the benefit of having been listening in, to some of the introductory remarks from the colleagues. So rather than, go with the remarks that basically I had prepared already, I will pick up from where they started. So there's a little bit of continuity. I think everybody was in agreement, that there is no lack of funding, right? I mean, there is a lot of funding out there. It's a matter of how do we bridge that gap between the supply and the demand. And oftentimes, as PwC, we find ourselves in that role, especially with the work I do with cities, is how do we help them basically present their projects as bankable projects that would pass the litmus test for a private sector investor. And some of the difficulties, in addition to having sort of like the label on a city of a credit rating and the lack thereof of having that credit worthiness, that because of the very little number of cities that have actually managed to do that, there are a lot of other structural difficulties that we often find. I mean, first of all, it is as basic as awareness. And I'm not talking about the Londons, the New Yorks, the Sao Paulos of the world. I'm talking about second and third tier cities in developing countries. I happen to have lived in Brazil for over 7 years of my career. Last week, I was actually hosting in Dubai a group of Brazilian mayors, basically from second and third tier cities. And we were talking to them about a lot of the infrastructure projects that are happening here in the Middle East and elsewhere. And their first question is, this is great, but how do I pay for it? And it's not for, and mainly it's that lack of capability of being able to present the business case. Sometimes it's even, the constraints they have from the procurement processes and how to involve the private sector early. Sometimes it's actually the lack of political will. Many of these projects basically will take more than one term of office for them to show the results. And a lot of these projects will not show immediate political return for them to be re-elected or to have their legacy. And sometimes they don't want to start on a project whose benefits will be inherited by the next mayor or by the opposition. So there are a lot of structural issues besides the ability and the capacity to actually work with the private sector, involve them early, and establish the business cases. Now, the good news is that there are exceptions, be it through the world basically that the Multilateral Development Bank has been doing, the infrastructure hub, that are starting to provide this type of coaching. And good for us as PwC sometimes pay our fees basically to be able to do these feasibility studies of bankable projects, so that when actually it's financing time, there is an ability to leverage some of the national programs, but also give the private sector the confidence that they are not the only ones bearing the risk. There is a little bit of funding coming from the center of government. There's other funding, coming from the city or the region itself, and then they can come up, with complementing that funding. Technology is the area where a lot of those new business models, new financing models have started. It's going to take a little bit of time, to start looking at some of those innovating funding models that are coming in technology, and whether it's providing some of these services using a pay-as-you-go model or any of these more innovative models, basically to get the payback. But the question is, how do we get the cities in developing countries, be it Brazil, South Africa, India, to really have the capacity and the thinking that they can work with the private sector, bring them in early, co-design, adjust the procurement, regulations, and make sure at the same time there is transparency, as Alice was mentioning, and also to be able to do blended financing from multiple sources and really standardize the process and simplify it. So not every single new city that wants to enhance its water sanitation system or its waste management systems has to go through the same learning curve by making sure that these models and these learnings are made readily available for those second and third tier cities in developing countries. And I'll stop here.
Hassan, I'd like to dig into some of the comments that you make, but I'll restrain myself for a second. And I would love to open up to the audience to see if there are any questions. You might want to just unmute yourself and make questions directly to the panel, or you can also write them down and I can just put them into discussion. So the floor is open now, and please raise your hands. I think that's the best way to organize this, and I'll just call you up if there are any questions. I'm on my phone, so I might be missing some hands. Jeannie, am I missing any hands? No.
We're obviously so clear and well understood.
Okay,
sorry. Maybe I have a question.
Yeah, and
you can hear me. I will have a question.
Actually, that's the spirit of if there were not questions, and I mentioned this to you, all of you in the panel, let's have a conversation. How often do we get all these brilliant minds and experience in a room. Jerome, please carry on, and let's
Absolutely.
among ourselves also and share and ask questions to elaborate from others. Yeah, please.
Exactly. I mean, I'm so passionate about the topic, so sorry for that. Infrastructure goes to the heart of our economies, it goes to the heart of societies, heart of lives, and how can we improve our lives? We really need it. Urban adaptation, climate change is the biggest economic threat out there. What I find amazing, what I really find amazing, and a question to the group, and maybe Alice from the WEF and maybe Hazem from the PwC, you would have an answer to it. I'm involved in infrastructure financing since 2012 about, or 2013, something like that. I presented at a G20 finance ministers meeting under Australia's leadership, kind of a blueprint, how from an investor's perspective, we could see the MDBs providing credit enhancement to make it an asset class, but yet we see from an institutional investor's perspective, we see many very good initiatives from MDBs like the World Bank that I just mentioned, but we don't see the big bang. We don't see the big bang approach like, hey, let's make infrastructure a global asset class so that you can invest as I don't know, as it would be a sovereign bond. There's no this standardization that we just talked about. So I wonder whether Alice or Hazem or even Benjamin, you would have a perspective on that. What do you see as the blocking stone? Why is it that politically there is kind of a lack of execution? I think at the end of the day, I see this as maybe the biggest hurdle, a lack of execution from public sector perspective, not the lack of willingness, but lack of execution to coordinate internationally. I see that as a really big hurdle. So maybe that's just my perspective, but I'm speaking now with my heart and also from the experience with that topic. Thank you.
Well, I can throw in something from my perspective because this is a kind of political economy question. And one way you can look at it is because, for instance, most economists will say, let's put a carbon price, let's put a carbon tax. 80% of the job is done, whatever it is. But you can see from a political economy point of view, carbon taxes are very unpopular, and most governments or even local governments have not been able to enact very strong carbon pricing and have had a lot of pushback from it. And so then you get the state where political economy is they don't really want to go down that route because of a lot of the pushback, and you can see it in the US. You know, if you ask the person in the street, 35% of the US at the moment does not believe in man-made climate change. So there is a political economy question where if you are democratically representative of that, there's kind of 35% of your constituents who don't really view very much. Which is why I had that left field thing on governance as one particular way around it, which I think Taiwan has done. The second thing you can do in terms of that is these ideas of like climate assemblies or citizen juries of involving people. The other thing which I think is really interesting from a policy perspective is potentially there's political willingness to do it on a kind of industry or sector by sector standards rather than something which goes at a federal basis. And this is where I think cities might be uniquely placed, because if you can gather together a group of industry participants and get them to agree by their own sector, like we've seen, for instance, in electrification of cars, or we might see it in transport on that, but have it done either through, say, a buildings lens, or you could even do it through a lens of industry about how they're dealing with their own buildings or infrastructure, then you can do that via a kind of essentially sort of an industrial policy or an industrial standards without having to get some of the complications around the political economy. It's a kind of technocratic solution rather than what, and is not as elegant, for instance, as a carbon price, but it is probably more politically tenable, and you can see some of those net benefits in terms of jobs and things and that from an industry. But I think that political economy question is because people aren't that involved. The information they have is not necessarily super good, and some of it is quite complicated, right? I was trying to explain to someone the other day the difference between carbon scope 1 and 2 and 3, you know, and this was in the pub. It wasn't really going very well, right? Because this is the kind of conversation. And so with that sort of complication, it's quite hard in what's, I think, a politically more polarized view where you do things because your tribe does things rather than looking at any data or information. And so that's one way around it. But I think particularly on the US, there is that political economy question, maybe a little bit less so in Europe. But even there, you have this range of opinions that you're trying to bring in. And to me, that's one of these key questions. And the second order question from that comes is this sense of fairness. How do you make it fair in all of these type of questions, which I don't think has been that well answered, which is why one of these things comes up. But I'd be interested in your or anyone else's view, maybe Alice or even back to Jerome.
So just in terms of what Jerome was saying, I think the first thing we've all agreed on is funds is not a problem. And because funds is not a problem, then the investors don't necessarily have to go around chasing individual governments. They invest in the projects that come to them. And if we think about, why are infrastructure projects not coming forward and being invested in at the rate that they should be, I think a huge amount of it relates to politics. And I can think in terms of my professional career, when I started 20 years ago, there's business cases that I worked on, which were very viable business cases for infrastructure projects. And those infrastructure projects are still not built. And that was in the UK, the US. And there's one, I always remember this project very, very well, which was an underground metro system in Dublin. And it made absolute sense in that it was the connector of all transit in the city. And this project meant that you could get the maximum capacity from every type of transit in the city. And we did the business case back in 2007 with a view to the project, commencing at the latest around 2010. And the project was going to cost at that particular point in time about 4 billion to construct. The last I heard about that project, they're now saying that they are planning to go to ground in 2040. And they're now saying that that project's going to cost about 20 billion. So that's an example of why did that happen? It happened for a number of reasons. There was not cross-party political consensus that this was a priority infrastructure project, not just for their capital city, but their country. And that consistently happens. So, where you don't have that, you have a change in government and they kick the project down, the can, if you like, down the road. So, and I think that is a real problem to trying to accelerate infrastructure projects, is where you don't have cross-party support. What I would say is there are some examples of where they're trying to address this. And I do have to call out the effort in the UK at the moment, where the core cities of the UK have come together with the new National Infrastructure Bank, with the relevant officials from national government, and they're trying to identify a critical pipeline of projects that they need to bring forward in the 10 core cities in the UK to address climate, and think about how they can package them. And by virtue of packaging them, they're more likely to attract investment, and they can demonstrate that there's a pipeline of projects for investment. And I think the interesting thing here is the national level political system is the Conservative Party. At the city level in those cities, it's generally the Labour Party or others. So there's a difference in political leadership, but they're somehow managing to come together and agree a critical pipeline of projects that they want to focus on from an investment point of view. Also, I think I have to call out Canada in terms of what they did with their Smart Cities Challenge. So whilst they call it a Smart Cities Challenge, it's really about, reinvigorating their cities and making them fit for purpose in terms of climate, technology, etc. And I guess that initiative came out of the Infrastructure and Communities Ministry of Canada. But what it meant was that every village, town, city in Canada created a vision for what they wanted their city to be. And out of that, were identified a number of catalyst projects. So the very best visions won awards, and those awards were tiny. They weren't going to change anything. But aside from that, what the government did do was agree to double infrastructure spend. So the Infrastructure and Communities Ministry spoke to the Finance Ministry. They agreed that they would make capital available for, key infrastructure projects. And the other thing is, of course, they have an infrastructure bank. So they were able to, again, lend for critical projects. So I think it was what they had in Canada is a whole of government approach to addressing infrastructure. And what we generally are lacking, whether it's in the global north or the global south, is a whole of government approach to infrastructure and cross-party consensus on, these are the critical infrastructure projects that we need to invest in our country. And when you have a change of political leadership, no matter where it is, some of the very best infrastructure projects are just thrown out, unfortunately. And also, I think another thing, when a crisis arises, they don't use that crisis effectively. And, what we're seeing right now, for example, because of the geopolitical crisis that we have in Europe emerging out of the war in Ukraine, we're actually going backwards in terms of climate action. Admittedly, it's short term, and there's a recognition that we need to transition in the medium to long term, but there is a backward step at the moment in that we are, looking at investments in more fossil fuel related projects, and we're not effectively using this crisis to accelerate retrofits of homes right across Europe, for example, so that the amount of energy that people need is actually reduced. So I think when we get a crisis, whether it's political, whether it's financial, our governments are not effectively using that crisis as well.
Thanks.
Thank you, Alice. And I see Hasem's hand, but let me use my expression as a moderator to ask, to just further challenge this conversation. A lot of what I've heard, it's applicable to both mitigation and adaptation. And that's, I would say is the first step. If we're talking of private investment, is broadly. But let's while we're thinking of, how to address it, what are the additional qualifiers that you would think of in terms of when we talk about adaptation projects? So in addition to all the things that we've mentioned in terms of the challenges and opportunities for infrastructure projects as a whole in cities, what are additional qualifiers, additional challenges that we might need to be aware of and opportunities in the adaptation space? So Hasem, with that additional challenge, I'll give the floor to you.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted also to follow on the point that Alice was mentioning, because I think if we don't get political alignment as a whole of government approach, this is partially also because the way we've been looking at a lot of these infrastructure projects, they have been assessed based on a pure financial return on investment. And the minute we start broadening the lens so that we're doing a total impact assessment of the project, not economic, environmental, social, taxes, all of that, all of a sudden, we are going to be looking at these projects in a completely different manner. And the public will be able to pressure sometimes the politicians, because if they are aware of what is the potential of reducing, sort of like pollution, generating jobs, being able to reduce commute time, all of these additional benefits that sometimes are not always done in a pure financial calculation, we would be able to guarantee some of that continuity across party lines, opposition, because at the end of the day, we made the public and the NGOs and other interested parties more aware of the true value of some of these projects, so they don't become just a political tool for someone who is looking for re-election or is simply not very interested in passing on the benefits of a project to the next mayor or governor.
Hasem, thank you so much. I see Jeannie's and Mauricio's hands up, so I'll pass it to Jeannie and then Mauricio.
Sure, I'd like to go back to Jerome's question about why can't infrastructure be considered as an asset class? When we think about the large investors and they need to balance their portfolios and they're looking between stocks and bonds and property and commodities and so forth, what's the resistance to adding infrastructure as an asset class? I'm wondering if anybody could answer that question, maybe Ben or Alice or Hasem.
Don't be shy.
In my view, I mean, we cannot sort of like look at all types of infrastructure. I mean, there's so many different models, so many different subtypes and classes, and some of them, very frankly, will never lend themselves basically to the private sector, be it because of the revenue flows and all of that. I think what we probably need to do is look at all the different subclasses and make sure that at least for those subclasses where there are proven business models, we can start with those. And then for those ones where, that will always be sort of like left up to the government, be it national government or city government, to actually make that initial investment. Maybe we can bring in the private sector to operate at some, later stage, or never at all. But I think there is, even with those asset classes or subclasses that have proven models, I don't think we have scaled enough to cover as much as we can.
I see Jerome has got a view on this.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, we have a view on this, and actually, thanks for putting on the table again, Jeannie. So what does it do? What do we need to have standardization? It could happen. I mean, the standard answer you always hear from the structures, more from the banking side rather than from the investor side, and also actually from infrastructure managers, is that it's very bespoke infrastructure project. Yes, sure, that's very true. But every corporate bond that you lend as a debt security is also bespoke. It's complex. If you think about the big prospectus, if you download it from Bloomberg and have a look at all the data, but still, a corporate bond, it would have a template in terms of the key financial market characteristics that you would look for to assess as an investor the credit characteristics. This is why we are calling from Swiss Re. This is why we are calling from the European Financial Services Roundtable. And this is why we have been calling also through the Global Infrastructure Facility and through all our efforts that we have been doing so far. Let's get standardization into standardized contract terms, into the procurement, into disclosure requirements. I attached in the chat this 1 or 2 pages we put together when we worked with the European Financial Services Roundtable. It's transparency at the end of the day, what we need to have. Now, this is quite abstract. What it means maybe for the multilateral development banks. What does it mean for the multilateral development banks? Well, they do their job and they do a great job. That's for sure. I think what they could do more is work more together. The EBRD, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in Europe, the EIB in Luxembourg, European Investment Bank, which is, by the way, an even bigger infrastructure investor than the World Bank, or the World Bank itself with the Global Infrastructure Facility. If they would come together and say, as MDBs, this is what we see as the gold standard for standardization. This is what we want to see in each of our transactions which we support as minimum kind of requirements. This is the template we would like to see. And if this minimum requirement and template is not visible, we won't lend money. Then this would create a marketplace out there. So effectively, we need critical mass to have a gold standard out there. One institutional investor, whatever big they are, won't be enough. You need to have a consortium, and you need to have the public side involved. So I think this is basically what I think really needs to happen. The public side getting together to create the gold standard. Maybe I can offer one additional dimension. And the US has the biggest, deepest capital markets in the world. And if you look at Build America bonds, there were a taxable municipal bond which were created under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2009, the Build America bonds, but also the municipal bond market. These are widely accessible even for the non-sophisticated investor. So there is already kind of a framework to get funding for infrastructure, but we definitely need more of municipal bond market type of instruments that are geared to sustainable infrastructure, and we need to reopen the Build America bonds and maybe have a Build Community bond market.
Maybe
Thank
maybe the title infrastructure is too broad. This is what Hazem was saying, that maybe it ought to be just be transportation and water, or you know, some critical infrastructure. Ben, would you invest in infrastructure as an asset class?
Yes, and perhaps more importantly, regardless of any individual investor, the characteristics, sort of yield, return, volatility of these type of infrastructure across it are exactly the kind of characteristics that most sophisticated institutional investors need something of, and then even unsophisticated investors would benefit from having some of this type of asset characteristic in most of their portfolios as well, if they had access to this, whether it's actually even a private market more type thing or something within that. So actually there is definitely a net benefit from getting this through to most people's portfolios, whether they're as sophisticated or not. And so that's why I think the points Jerome makes are pretty important. And it could be quite large amounts of capital do that. But again, there's actually regulatory headwinds for that rather than tailwinds, both at an institutional level and even at a more retail level.
Maybe Alice can get the World Economic Forum to work on this.
Yeah. I'm sure I think they are, right?
Yes. Just to come back to Jerome's point as well, I think just in terms of the multilateral system that we have globally, often cities don't have a place at the table, and our infrastructure representatives have a limited place at the table. I think the Global Infrastructure Hub, as the official mechanism of the G20, has been starting to fill that void. But I think we've had a lack of standards because cities don't have a place at the table, and it tends to be finance ministries that's at the table rather than infrastructure ministries. So, and the two need to be connected if you're going to, with cities, if you're going to develop standards in the space. So I think that prevented a lot of standardization.
Thank you, Alice. Mauricio, let's go to you for your question.
Yeah, after hearing Alice and Hazem's comments on political motivations around urban adaptation projects, I couldn't resist the temptation to comment on that in my capacity as a former politician. So Hazem was making this list of the different benefits that come out from adaptation projects. And I will add a very important one from the perspective of politicians, from the perspective of mayors. At the end of the day, it is about protecting people's lives. So if you don't undertake these projects that at the beginning may not look as politically sexy, if you don't do them, actually the political cost of not doing them would be devastating for mayors and other local authorities. And this is something that will keep increasing over time as we will be seeing more frequent and devastating natural disasters as a result of climate change. So I will add to the equation this aspect. It is not a matter of just doing undertaking adaptation projects because of all of those benefits that Alice and Hazem mentioned, but also because it is a political urgency for mayors to do so, because if they don't, the risk is huge.
Thank you, Mauricio. Let me introduce a further point. While listening to you, there is so much, structure and organizational infrastructure and governance infrastructure needs to be developed in order for some of these elements that have been shared to play out, particularly in developing countries, in cities in developing countries. So, are there ways in which certain financial sources or financial vehicles could be used that don't need to go through those hoops of creditworthiness and political mandates and political tensions between central governments and local governments? One element that has been mentioned in the past is it's insurance. How insurance as a commercial vehicle, financial vehicle, could be used to support both preparedness and then recovery from for against climate disasters, climate-induced disasters. Is that a way, a mechanism or a source that you would consider, and have you seen that playing out in parallel to all this conversation about creditworthiness and organizational governance for cities?
Yeah, maybe I can respond to Jerome speaking, since you asked about insurance question, right? Your question being, does insurance, the underwriting part of risk against natural catastrophes, does it play a big part in supporting cities infrastructure projects? I would say it increasingly does. There's more potential to do more. You see some high-level transactions being supported by Swiss Re and the World Bank for some middle-income and low-income developing countries. They're out there in the public domain. You see them much less at the city level. You see them a little bit at the provincial level, but much less obviously at the city level, for the reasons that some of the previous speaker, I think was Alicia, mentioned. They are not part of the table through. So it's harder to access them. But yeah, in terms of protecting, the question is also, are federal or city or municipalities balance sheet, fiscal balance sheet, being protected against natural catastrophes as they are upgrading the infrastructure, physical capital stock through infrastructure? And there the answer is much less so. So that definitely would be much more potential to do so. I mean, we see it in our data. We see it in our data in terms of climate change. If I look at it in the US specifically, there's no state in the US which is not being exposed to flood risk. Flood risk has been the #1 peril last year globally, causing natural catastrophes. If I look at the average payout of natural catastrophes from the insurance industry, $100 billion. Last year it was again higher, the fourth costliest year ever globally. And if you look at the amount of economic losses which is not being insured, and at the end of the day, that amount of economic losses, it's big part of it is physical infrastructure. 75% of economic losses caused by natural catastrophes are not being insured. 75% globally, and whether you look at the US or whether you look at Germany or any other countries, that ratio is pretty much the same, which basically tells you again in a number there's much more potential to also protect balance sheets by insurance. And part of it is education, part of it is also having that risk culture at state level, federal level, or municipal level to take insurance as part of the equation as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerome. Hazem, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you mentioned this, Jorge, and to sort of like build on Jerome's comment, and he's in the insurance business, so I have to be careful with what I say here before, to make sure it adds up. I mean, a couple of years ago, the idea of creating a cities-run fund that actually acts almost like as an insurance for cities based on sort of like small premium based on contributions that they will pay, so that when one of them is hit by a disaster, it can actually at least have the basic sums of money to recover. This idea was floated under the Urban 20, which is the urban group, basically under the G20. The idea really didn't go very far, although there was a substantial level of interest and validation that was done in thinking about the concept and designing it. Mauricio and myself and others, Jeannie on this call, Alice, we're all part of that group, that discussed it. Even Lolita was part of that discussion from her days with New York City. But I mean, something like that, I think, needs to eventually be brought back to the table, and thinking about how would it work, how it would be governed, what would be the role of, you know, the Swiss Re's of the world and other insurance and financial institutions in bringing that together, so that we don't have to scramble every time a second or third or even first tier city is hit with a natural disaster. I don't know, Mauricio, if you want to, you know, follow on. I know you were very passionate about this when the concept was discussed.
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up, Hasim. I think it's fundamental to do something like that. If you look at the way the international financial system is framed, you won't find a financial facility that cities, particularly in the developing world, can access to directly. So the idea of creating what we call then the Global Urban Resilience Fund was precisely about developing a mechanism through which cities could have access to resources in case of a natural disaster, or in general, an external shock could hit. And the beauty of it was that it was designed in such a way that it was going to be managed by a cities platform, in this case, the Urban 20, unlike what's going on today. I mean, there are different urban focus funds managed, for example, by multilateral development banks. But at the end of the day, those banks are governed by national governments, which follow a different logic than cities. So the fact of having a financial facility managed by cities for cities following an urban logic, in my view, is indispensable. Even more so if we take into account the greater risk that cities will be facing because of what we mentioned before. Increasingly severe natural disasters as a result of climate change, and not only natural, also things like COVID-19 and different external shocks. So I think this is the kind of ideas that should be discussed further. How can we empower cities financially to have direct access to financial resources coming from the public, but also from the private sector, by bringing to the table everybody providing their inputs and their ideas.
Thank you, Mauricio. Jerome, and I would love to then circle back on some of the points that Mauricio, particularly on public-private partnerships. I'd like to explore more, because we've talked about, you know, private and public, and what the public needs to do for the private to come in. But I assume that there might be some space to explore also public-private partnerships to test some of these elements that were mentioned. So Jerome, please.
Well, I'm all in with public-private partnerships. That's the whole idea of the MDPs. They do the public, we do the private one. We need more of that, and if you would have more standardization, you would scale up the PPPs. I would like to quickly react to what you, Hassem, said. Totally agree. Urban 20, and if the cities get together and pool the infrastructure project, that's fantastic. So yes, I agree. It needs to be managed by the cities. If they can pool projects together, it's in some sense it's also a kind of aggregation platform. You aggregate a pool of smaller, maybe even below investment grade infrastructure assets into, and you could even aggregate it into securitized vehicles. I mean, this has been done at the national level by the IFC, International Finance Corporation in DC, with the MCCP program. I'm a huge fan. I haven't seen it at a city level. I think it's doable to pool it, securitize it, and yes, you still need the reinsurance part. So we will be open for the business, no question about that. Yeah, I think we need these initiatives. Sounds good to me.
I completely agree on that. I thought it was a really unique opportunity to try and create a way of getting what cities needed to do to transition to the finance ministers of the G20 and try and get buy-in to fund critical infrastructure, certainly put the public sector share of the funding into infrastructure projects. I think it certainly was a missed opportunity, but I think there's an opportunity to revisit it. My understanding is that Saudi Arabia is actively looking at a fund that would be specifically focused on cities, and if they're doing so, I think that has to be welcomed, and I hope that other governments will follow their lead.
I'll just jump in and say I think it's a really good idea as well. There's been quite an influential book amongst economists called Capitalism Without Capital by Stian Westlake and Jonathan Haskell, who's part of the Bank of England committee. And they've just launched another book called Restarting the Future. What they show is that intangible capital is one of the bottlenecks. And then their thesis is the problem is that a lot of our old institutions have been dealing with a tangible world, and new institutions are needed to do the coordination problems of intangibles. And you think the problem is tangible. So you think the problem is heat pumps, or you think the problem is design, but you realize actually we have heat pumps and we have a lot of the technology and design. The problem is coordination of people, capital and organizations, and that it'd be much easier to do this within new organizations, and new organizations designed for these future problems like resiliency and adaptation, where there were no organizations designed for that in the last 100 years. The closest you kind of get is to the public sanitation works that you had 200 years ago, and with that. And again, the problem wasn't kind of building the sewers. The problem was, the coordination around that. And to the extent, as Jerome pointed out, that whatever the number is exactly, 60 or 70% of people are going to be living in cities by 2050. They're a huge share of GDP. They're a huge share of carbon intensity, and they're also a huge share of the solution. So to the extent that cities actually have more in common with one another and can have these organizational layer to organize for these new risks and opportunities that they face, I think that could be a very interesting solution. And again, to Jerome's point, then the reinsurance and the other parts around that could well be taken up by private sector as well. So there is a whole infrastructure which that could plug into if you could just get over that kind of initial hump of a new organization for some of these new threats going through, and they adjacent to other threats like pandemic and other things for that. I'll hand back to
everybody thinks it's such a great idea, but we don't have the details worked out. How could we get the details worked out?
That's a good question. Well, for instance, so if I was doing it as a benign dictator, what you would do is you could convene something like the C40 group or the World Economic Forum group. So these where all you've got city mayors and people to go it. You would host actually something what I would call an open space conference. So this is what Taiwan did when they needed to generate ideas and consensus. You could also use a governance system called Polis. And again, that clusters ideas. And so from that, you would get a cluster of like, these are the ideas and things that essentially cities agree upon. It's also very good for finding consensus when you've got opposing views about where they do agree upon. And then that body would assign some essentially policy or technocratic makers for saying, how could we craft something which meets these 10 goals, which were agreed at C40 or World Economic Forum from that? And given that those goals are, I think it would be plausible to do that. And then you'd have to question, are city citizens willing to fund this with an extra tax or somehow? Is there another revenue source, or is there not? Can you pull it from whatever we have? Some of it would use operational or human capital already, wouldn't be extra tax. It would be knowledge. Some people might be able to fund money. So there's a plausible route to it because we have some of these coordinating organizations, but with a goal to answering that question. And we have these new governance systems or ideas like open space or things to do it, and actually now digital technologies to actually implement it. So it is doable now. And I could, I as a benign dictator could put some of this thing through without telling people what the answer would be. That's just a process to get consensus and an answer. And why I'm partially optimistic is that Taiwan managed to do it on some quite complicated like difficult questions. Some of it was social political, and some of it is in this. So I think it's doable. And I'll hand back to you guys.
Thank you, Ben. I'm looking at the time, and Mauricio, I would love to hear. We have two options. We can close with some remarks on a provocative question that we could put to each of the panelists, or we can also try to bring this conversation around the fund to an actionable element after this panel. So we discussed what we want to do with that idea right now. We see, what could be the next steps, and we can sort of move on out of this panel on having that conversation, and we agree on some next steps in this panel. That's the R route, which I wouldn't mind exploring.
I rely on your role as a moderator, and a great one. So I definitely trust you on that. I just want to say that I think that the way to go about this is actually bringing everybody to the table. National governments acknowledging the need for cities to have access to direct financial facilities. And that might sound logical, but unfortunately, in many cases, it's not, because of political concerns, right? So we need to bring national governments understanding that, for example, addressing climate change in a proper way will be impossible without an effective role from cities. So in order for cities to play that effective role, they need funding. And countries will never meet their NDCs and the Paris Agreement goal without the role from cities. So we need to have national governments supporting an idea like this. We need to have the NDBs, because the money that they are trying to channel to cities now could be devoted through a financial facility that would be directly disbursed to cities. And we, of course, need to bring the private sector as well. So I'll stop there just to provoke a reaction and hopefully very concrete steps on this or other disruptive ideas, which in my view, it's what's needed to foster urban adaptation and in general, tackling climate change in cities.
So in addition to this amazing panel that is here, plus Mauricio and Ginny, who else should we bring again to this conversation to follow on the fund? I think that that idea, it's brilliant. Mauricio shared that with me at that moment when it was happening. We discussed a bit that. Where does it stand, and who owns it? So how can we move it along and be helpful in that effort? And when I say we, I'm including the panelists. So you didn't know that you were invited to this panel to also take on additional responsibilities. Mauricio, Hasem, where does this stand? Where do we?
Yeah. So the idea first came up actually during the presidency of Riyadh of the Urban 20. I would suggest basically that we go back to Fahd Rashid, who is actually the one who's running the Royal Commission for Riyadh, and try to find if he's willing to take it forward, great. If not, the U20 continues. There has been other presidencies since then, with the co-presidency of Rome and Milan, currently Jakarta. And I think the infrastructure facility is probably, infrastructure hub, is going to be probably a critical player in this, because they play that role basically at the G20 ministerial level. So their contribution is going to be key. And Alex, as I think about our GFC and its alumni network, I think we've got everybody there who can drive this forward, if you will.
Yeah, I think we do. I think one of the things at the moment with the Global Infrastructure Hub is that it whilst it funds infrastructure in cities, it identifies as a national government mechanism, but that's by virtue of the way our multilateral system is set up. I totally agree with Maurizio. I think it's really important that you're bringing the multi-stakeholders together, and that means all arms of government that are responsible for infrastructure. It means the MDBs, the national infrastructure banks. It means the private sector, civil society, and academia. And I'm really interested in getting a model that can work and if you can get a model working in one G20 country, how can you replicate it in another, and how can you take it to the global south as well? And that's why I'm really interested in what they're trying to do in the UK, in that you have the 10 cities of the UK coming together, trying to identify what are the critical climate projects that they need to implement, and working with national government to think about how they can create the capacity to take them to the next stage. How can they get them funded? And the fact that the private sector, in all its guises, in terms of the engineering and construction world, the investors and the insurers, etc., are all part of bankers, etc., part of that conversation. That I really like. We have to watch this space to see how it turns out. But if that becomes a model that is successful, I think we really have to look at how we can replicate that type of model in many more countries around the world, because you do need to tackle this both from the national government and the city government level.
Alice, thank you so much. And I'm looking at the time. I'm going to turn to Mauricio and Ginny for following up on this idea. I think it will be worth, at this, resurfacing a bit of that with some of the inputs that came from this conversation. Alice's idea, Jerome's, Ben's inputs on Taiwan, elements that we might not have had when you were thinking about this idea, and some of the latest developments on other aspects on climate change. So with that, I'll close. Looking at Ginny and Mauricio, thank you so much for the invitation, and your team, and Ben, pleasure to have spent the last hour and a half with you. Thank you for your time and inputs and experience sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
This was a sensational panel, really, really productive and very, very interesting, with a roadmap for or at least a plan to develop a roadmap for going forward with a real project. So thank you very much, panelists, and thank you very much, Jorge, for organizing the discussion around this. And we will definitely follow up with you to see where we can take this. We're now